This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Thank you, Gleaves, for that generous introduction. I could spend half of my evening telling you about friends and colleagues who have spoken to me through the years of Grand Rapids and Holland. This is my first time, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored. I'd like to begin this evening with a question. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? Almost everyone. I want you to get in touch perhaps with the first time you were there, maybe as a school child. So many school trips go to Washington. Or maybe recently you were there, maybe with children or grandchildren. The Park Service visitors tell us it is the second most visited place in Washington, second only to the Vietnam Memorial, but I suspect last year, which was the Lincoln Bicentennial, it may have been the most visited place in Washington. You recall how you walk up those steps and the first thing you see is that tall, 29-foot-high Daniel Chester French statue of Lincoln. Someone told me a few days ago she went as a child and wanted to get into Lincoln's lap. Then you walk into what I call that temple space in a very noisy city. All of a sudden, everyone becomes quiet. If you turn to the left, carved on one panel is the Gettysburg Address. If you turn to the right, carved on 3 panels in Indiana limestone, is the second inaugural address. Now, tonight's going to be very interactive, so I want to ask you, if you'd be willing, just a few of you, to speak out. What was the feeling that you had when you were there a long time ago or perhaps recently? Would anybody be willing to just give voice to that feeling?
Reverence.
Reverence?
The eyes.
The eyes?
Memorable. Memorable.
Memorable. Awestruck. Well, those words pretty much pick up the feelings that we have. Some people have answered that question to me with tears in their eyes. Reverence, memorable, awestruck. The reason that I have set out to write my books about Lincoln, and especially this new biography, is my conviction, however, that awe is not necessarily the same thing as understanding. You and I might go to a musical concert, and we might feel, my goodness, this music really did something for me, but that doesn't necessarily mean we understand it. When I was a student at UCLA, I sang in the a cappella choir. It was directed by Roger Wagner, who was the founder of the Roger Wagner Chorale. It was a remarkable experience. In our junior year, we sang Bach's St. John's Passion. And when it was over, Wagner, in his typical way, said, now next year we're going to do something more difficult. Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. And I had been literally moved to tears in singing that beautiful composition, but I understood quickly afterwards, I don't really understand this music. So in my senior year, I took 2 courses for non-music majors, one on Bach and one on Beethoven. Well, all of us in this room, I'm sure, would say, with President Gerald Ford, that we have this reverence for Lincoln. But as was suggested by Gleaves in his introduction, there is layer after layer after layer. Is there more to understand? I'd like to suggest this evening an analogy that I want to open up just a few of the windows on Lincoln. Some of these come from recent scholarship that might surprise you. Is there anything new turning up of Lincoln? Well, about 20 years ago, for example, a professor at then Sangamon State College in Illinois got into his mind that if Lincoln had practiced law for 23 and a half years in Illinois, was it possible that there were any legal cases that were still sitting around in the 102 county courthouses of Illinois? So he dispatched a team of master students, and they found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Lincoln legal cases in the basements of these courthouses. Invariably, they were rolled up. Many of them had turned blue with age, and almost always Abraham Lincoln's name had been razor-bladed out, probably in the 19th century. The place where I work, the Huntington Library, put on a great Lincoln exhibit last year, and the curator says that in a sense Lincoln was our first rock star, and the way that you wanted to remember him was by his autograph. But of course his handwriting is so distinctive that it was not difficult to discern this was Lincoln's legal cases. So I spent more time in my biography than I'd anticipated talking about Lincoln the lawyer. I spent more time than I anticipated talking about Lincoln the commander-in-chief. He checked books out of the Library of Congress to teach himself to be really our first commander-in-chief. Well, we know the story of all those generals who he needed to teach until he finally found one, Ulysses S. Grant. Perhaps the thing that attracted me the most and really intrigued me was how could this man of less than 1 year of formal education become this incredible person? Well, one way he did it is he would take little slips of paper and he would write out ideas or notes to himself, reflections, often beginning with a question. We've kind of missed them because they're scattered throughout the collected works of Lincoln. The editors called them fragments, but they're far more than fragments. For example, several of them, a number of them, actually focus on slavery. One of them, undated, but it's probably between 1854 and 1856, begins, as Lincoln often did, with a question. How is it that one person can hold another person in slavery? And then you can almost see Lincoln, the courtroom lawyer, walking around, and he says, well, could it be that the first person is more intellectual than the second? Could it be that the first person has greater economic standing than the second? Could it be, could it be, could it be? And at the end of the note, he simply writes, I cannot think of a single reason why one person can hold another person in slavery. In the last window that I will open for us tonight, we will discover a reflection that Lincoln wrote for his eyes only. He never thought we would ever see it. It was found after his death in the bottom drawer of his desk in the White House, and it just says so much about the journey, this private journey mostly, that Lincoln was on. Well, one window I wish I had opened more is Lincoln's humor. Today, humor sometimes, I think, is kind of a put-down humor. It's a hurtful kind of humor. Lincoln's humor was always laughing, not at other people, but at the culture in which he lived, and mostly at himself. I love the story of Lincoln driving along in a buckboard one day, a carriage with William Seward. Seward, you recall, had been his chief competitor for the Republican nomination. Now he was his Secretary of State. Talk about an odd couple. Lincoln would walk across the street to Lafayette Square to Seward's house. When he opened the door, Seward was smoking one of his 20 cigars that he smoked every day. Lincoln never smoked. Then Seward would have this elaborate liquor cabinet. Lincoln never drank. Then Seward would start into one of his off-color, smutty stories. Lincoln didn't tell those stories. And yet these two men, Seward thought he was better than Lincoln. He was governor of New York, senator of New York, and yet 6 weeks after Lincoln's term began, Seward wrote a letter to his wife back in Auburn, New York, and he simply said, Lincoln is the best of all of us. Lincoln is the best of all of us. Well, one day as they were driving along, the road got rougher and rougher, and the driver started swearing more and more, and finally Lincoln tapped him on the shoulder and he said, my good man, are you an Episcopalian? And the driver, quite startled, was speechless for a few minutes, and then he said, oh no, he said, I think maybe I'm a Methodist. Oh, he said, I thought you must be an Episcopalian. He said, you swear exactly the way Mr. Seward does, and he's an Episcopal church warden. Well, the first window I want to open tonight is Lincoln the politician. There's no real contradiction between Lincoln as a man of great ideals. I try to discern the interior moral compass that's in him, the fact that he's a very shrewd politician. But if you'll take the handout that is given to you as you came in, the first selection is the first campaign that Lincoln ever participated in. Barely 23 years of age. You remember he was born in 1809 in Kentucky, moved in 1816 to Indiana, where he lived for 14 years, and then in 1830 he crossed the boundary into Illinois, stayed with his parents a bit, and then went off on his own to the tiny little village of New Salem. I had a lot of fun last year. My publisher said, I think you should speak in Chicago on February 12th, so I spoke at the Newberry Library, and I had fun telling the Chicagoites that when New Salem got started, they thought they had a much better future than Chicago. Because when Lincoln arrived, New Salem had 125 residents, and Chicago had 60. And they were going to navigate that Sangamon River, and Chicago was sort of sitting up there, isolated in the boonies up there, you know. And so this is their future. Well, I think some people suggested Lincoln run for office. He could represent their interests. And the way you announced your candidacy was in the newspaper. And so barely 23 years of age, he had just turned 23, Lincoln offers this introduction of himself. I think these words speak across time. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. I'll vote for a candidate in 2010 who has that understanding of what politics should be about. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend. Well, his campaign interrupted by the Black Hawk War, Lincoln ran for the block of men running for so many seats in the Illinois State Legislature. Lincoln did not win. But in that region, that territory where the votes were counted, out of 305 votes, he received 279, the people who knew him best. 2 years later, as he became better known, as he moved out in various vocations, there were 14 men running for 4 seats in the Illinois State Legislature. He finished second of the 14. And within 2 years, he was the leader of his Whig party in the Illinois State Legislature, the antecedent of the Republican Party. He then, after 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature, his great ambition really was to serve in the United States Congress. They had in those days kind of a rotation system, and Lincoln was third man out of 3. So finally, his turn came, and he went to Congress. And he wrote home to his law partner, Willie Herndon, I know you're all anxious for me to speak, to make my mark, and I will. Just wait. Just wait. As freshman congressman, he spoke out in the most remarkable way. I need to say that in this appreciation of Lincoln, I found myself surprised that through the United States State Department, I was privileged to speak last year in Germany, Italy, and Mexico. In Mexico, I learned all about the American War. You and I thought it was the Mexican War. I learned about the American War, and I learned about the great Mexican hero, 5 feet tall, Indian by birth, Benito Juarez, whose great hero was Abraham Lincoln. And the mural in the great city of Monterrey to the 3 liberators of the Americas, and Lincoln is there as one of the 3 liberators. This amazing affection I found in Mexico for Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln did rather a startling move in his early month in Congress, and I have 2 selections here. The war with Mexico had already been going on for about a year, but there was a question, I don't know that we ever asked that question when you and I were in school, who started this war? It's just the assumption, of course, the Mexicans started this war. Listen to Abraham Lincoln. The House desires to obtain a full knowledge of all the facts, which to establish whether the particular spot of soil on which the blood of our citizens was so shed was or was not our own soil at the time. For Lincoln believed that at the very least we had drawn the Mexicans by a provocative action, forcing them to fire the first shot, but more probably we had taken the aggression by moving into territory that had been understood to be theirs. Not a popular stand for a first-term congressman. But wait, it gets better or worse. In January, just a few weeks later, he challenges the President of the United States. Now, I propose to show that the whole truth of this issue and evidence is, from the beginning to end, the sheerest deception. And after analyzing President Polk's 6 propositions defending his action, Lincoln says this: let him answer with facts and not with arguments. And it's interesting, Lincoln was so imbued with precedent, not simply as a lawyer, but he so loved the precedent of American history. Let him remember he sits where Washington sat, and so remember, let him answer as Washington would answer. In escalating rhetoric, Lincoln concludes, I more than suspect already that he is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him. That may not have been the Abraham Lincoln you studied in school. Lincoln found himself in a terrible dilemma. It's almost a current dilemma. He said, well, then you don't support the troops. He said, no, I support the troops. I'm against the policy. I'm against what we have done. And I have discovered that Ulysses S. Grant, who is my next biographical project, fought bravely in the Mexican War, but at the end of his life, in his memoirs, he said, this was the most immoral war our nation has ever fought. I am deeply embarrassed by it. Well, this was not exactly a speech by Lincoln engendered to win friends, and quickly this speech back home engendered all kinds of criticism. Even his partner offered this criticism. Lincoln came back. Yes, it was a rotation system, but he was told, thank you, you will never be elected to political office again. And the Whig who followed him was defeated for political office to the Democrat, and Lincoln assumed part of the blame for his role in this. But remarkably, Lincoln moves forward, losing one bid for the Senate in 1855, debating Stephen Douglas in 1855, and winning by losing. There was a gerrymander system in Illinois. We don't have that anymore. So that actually Lincoln had won the popular vote. But you may recall that the Senate was the one who elected a senator until 1912. And so the gerrymandered system allowed the Democrats to outvote the Republicans, even though they had less votes, popular votes, and Lincoln lost again. But then Lincoln is elected President of the United States. He stays for a long time in Springfield. It's a 4-month time. We moved it up in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second term to January 20th. And he prepares to leave. It's a remarkable scene. He goes to the train station in Springfield on that rainy February 11 morning. He has told the press that there will be no speech that day. As he walks into the depot, the newspaper correspondent, an immigrant from the New York Herald, is there, and he says Lincoln is so overcome with emotion he cannot even speak. You can see the tears rolling down his cheeks as his dearest friends say goodbye to him. But as he steps outside, there are 1,000 people waiting for him. And speech goes forward. It's sometimes been suggested that Lincoln might have prepared this speech. I don't think so. I think this speech is positively spontaneous, and I'll tell you why as we read it together. But let me say this to you. When I spoke in Berlin at the John F. Kennedy Institute, a part of the Free University, last April, the largest American studies program in Europe, afterwards we went out to dinner in Berlin to an Italian restaurant. And I was sitting next to a young German graduate student, and he said to me over dinner, you know what my favorite Lincoln speech is? And I said, no. He said, it's the farewell address to Springfield, and then he said it to me from memory in his second language. My friends, no one in my situation can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this time. Lincoln always was wary about sharing his feelings. He distrusted emotion and trusted reason, but this time he allows his feelings, because I don't think he was prepared, to come forth. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Notice the simple sentences. I now leave, and these words, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Is he greater than Washington? Absolutely not. No way. He understands that the task is greater than Washington. Well, Washington had a great task to lead this nation to its birth, but Lincoln understands that the task he is encountering will be even greater. And now listen to these words. This is not something people were ready or used to hearing. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and ever remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me. And the audience in that day, it's hard to understand how this could happen today, but it happened then. You know what their response was? We will pray for you. We will pray for you. When Lincoln got off the train in Rochester, New York, he rested on the Sabbath, and as he checked into his hotel room, he looked out the window, and here was this huge sign on the YMCA, "We will pray for you." Amazing. Well, how did Lincoln rise? I believe that Lincoln distinguished himself from some very able peers by his gift of public speaking. Now here we have a problem. I am terribly worried about our culture. We have a modern shibboleth. It's only words. I think we are devaluing words in our society. We are devaluing the beauty of the English language in our society, the care by which we should approach this. Someone told me at a previous stop that they had a contest for children in art, and that the children would write their name on the back, and they couldn't read the writing. So this year the teacher decided that none of the children would write their names, and she would, because the children couldn't write anyway. Well, we sometimes might want to think that Lincoln was simply a genius. Even though he had but 1 year of formal education, he had this gift. You know the story. I used to ask people if they believed this, but I don't ask it anymore because it was too disconcerting to hear the results. I'll ask it, but don't put up your hand. Do you believe that Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of a flap of an envelope on the train to Gettysburg? Don't put up your hand. That story was told by a sentimental novelist at the beginning of the 20th century. She sold it as a book, The Perfect Tribute. She made it into a movie. She said that her son was told this by his teacher, who was told this by his father, who was told that by Edward Everett, who was on the train to Gettysburg, and he was not. And that became required reading in English for 25 years in the United States of America. What I want to suggest is that Lincoln, and I love to say this to students, I'm not sure how many students, maybe you're sitting in the back, there are some students, there is no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. I can tell when you've turned in a paper that was written at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I write on the front of it, this is a first draft, it's not really acceptable. Lincoln couldn't do what he did as a first draft. When the crowds gathered after the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and they wanted him to speak, and he didn't really want to because he often wasn't very good spontaneously, but he felt he had to, so he began, what was it, 80-some odd years ago that our... But 4 months later, give him time, it comes out 407 years ago, our forefathers. Well, Lincoln, as he traveled to Washington, had prepared and worked very hard on the drafts of his inaugural address. He did something quite unusual. He showed them the 3 Illinois friends and got their editing advice too, just simply said, great. He arrived in Washington and he met Seward that first Saturday. They went to church at St. John's Episcopal on Sunday morning. Seward entertained Lincoln for lunch that day. And Lincoln said to Seward, here's a draft of my inaugural address. He didn't know his first inaugural address. Would, sir, I know you're a fine speaker, would you be willing to look at it? If you have any suggestions, I'd be willing to hear them. That night, at parlor number 6 at the Willard Hotel, there was a knock. Lincoln opened the door, and here was Frederick Seward, William's son, and he said, sir, my father has an envelope for you. Thank you very much. Lincoln takes the envelope and opens it. Here are 7 pages of suggestions on how to improve his inaugural address. Seward had taken the text and numbered it in red ink, every single line. He made 49 suggestions to Lincoln. Lincoln accepted 27 of them with some modification. And then when Lincoln turns to page 6, why, he reads Seward's words, as for your last paragraph, forget it. I have written 2 new last paragraphs for you. You may choose which one you would like to use. Can you imagine? Well, Lincoln chose one of Seward's last paragraphs to be his final paragraph of his inaugural address. If you'll turn the page. What I have tried to show you here, the column on the left are the sentences of Seward, and the column on the right is how Lincoln takes Seward's words and revises them into what I would call prose poetry. Seward begins, I close. Now, the best way that we would edit would be to cut extra words, extra adverbs, extra adjectives. It's very difficult to cut a 2-word sentence, however. So what is Lincoln doing here? He extends it. I am loath to close. To really understand Lincoln, I suggest that we need to hear his words out loud. In my books, I say to the reader, say these words out loud. I learned in studying American education that teachers asked students to read out loud until some afternoon in the 1930s when a frustrated teacher said something like, Johnny, you're disturbing Mary. Please read to yourself. And we've adopted this habit of reading to ourselves. I say to the students in the room, read your papers out loud, and you'll get a sense as to what is being said. So may I ask us to say out loud Lincoln's first sentence, and say it very slowly. You and I speak about 150 words a minute. Lincoln spoke only 110 or 115 words a minute. Let's hear what Lincoln is doing to change Seward. I am loath to close. Now, what is he doing? He's extending the meaning. I am loath to close. I close. He is also doing what in technical language we would call assonance. He is putting words of similar sound close together. He loves it. I am loath to close. 80. This is part of Lincoln's rhetorical skill. Well, the second sentence, Seward says, we must not be aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen and brethren. Barack Obama chose this sentence as his quotation from Lincoln in his acceptance speech at Grant Park in November of 2008. Listen how different it is from what Lincoln says. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Lincoln learns that less is more. It's a hard lesson for people to learn. We'll skip the third sentence. But now imagine to yourself that Lincoln, on page 7 of Seward's letter, as he's standing there in parlor 6 at the Willard Hotel, he reads out loud Seward's words, the mystic chords which proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves pass through all the hearts and all the hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. And I think Lincoln said to himself, my goodness sakes, what can I do with this? But watch what he does with it. It's simply remarkable. This sentence, the final sentence of the inaugural address, is just filled with meaning, and it still speaks to us today in 2010. Let's say it out loud together to catch its full meaning. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. One reason I've given this out to you is that you can take it home with you and look at it more closely. There are layers and layers of meaning. One thing that's, I think you may see quickly, is that Seward ends by saying, the guardian angel of the nation. Lincoln wants to make it more personal. He's calling the Union to be together. So he says the better angels of our nature, a much more powerful way of evoking a response from people. Well, I like to open up this window on Lincoln because it shows that although Lincoln is a great writer and a great speaker, he's able to take somebody else's words and change them into something that is poetic. We would not be reciting Seward's words this evening. He's got some good ideas, but Lincoln turns them into poetry. Just one more window. Of all the windows that were opened last year, I think the one that still needs to be opened more is Lincoln's religious journey. The traditional understanding has been that Lincoln is not a religious person. It is true that he never joined a congregation, but it's also true that he participated at First Presbyterian Church in Springfield and even much more at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. In my biography, I suggest that a missing person in the Lincoln story is Lincoln's minister at New York Avenue, Phineas Densmore Gurley, number one in his class at Princeton Seminary, a learned, powerful preacher who had been invited just before Lincoln was elected president to return to the Princeton Seminary faculty as their professor of preaching. And I suggest that Lincoln listens to Gurley. Especially does he listen in the greatest tragedy of their family's life. They had lost Eddie in 1850 when he was less than 4 years old. But the death of Willie in February of 1862, the boy most like the father, Mary, I think, never recovered from this death. She wore her mourning clothes for 12 months. She wouldn't even allow Willie's children ever again to set foot in the White House, his friends, ever again to set foot in the White House, because these little boys, his playmates, reminded her of her son. Well, Gurley preached the sermon that day. And he talked to the Lincolns and asked them to trust in biblical providence as the way of moving forward. Now, sometimes I like to give talks on Lincoln's second inaugural address. It's a remarkable address in which, in 701 words, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. But I always know that I'll probably be met with questions coming from the audience. They usually fall into 2 categories. They're often accusations, but questions are often statements, you know, that's the way it happens. So I would have someone make a question, really a statement, telling me, well, you must know, Dr. White, that simply to quote the Bible in the 19th century, I mean, that's what every cultured person did, so you must not make too much out of that. Lincoln quoted the Bible just like he quoted Shakespeare. Question 2. Well, Lincoln, don't you know, was a shrewd president. He was. And therefore, Lincoln is actually using the language of the audience. He understands that the audience is religious, so this is not really his language. There's really no integrity here. He's adopting the language of his audience. A lot of politicians do that. Aha. But there's one little scrap of paper that I suggested at the beginning. John Hay found it in Lincoln's drawer. There'll be a wonderful documentary coming out in October of this year, co-sponsored by Frontline and the American Experience. It will be called God in America, 6 hours. And 5 of those hours will be rather traditional figures in the story of God in America, but through the wonderful person who's doing hour 3, she and I are collaborating, and we're going to make Lincoln central in hour 3, and we're going to have what you have before you here central in that hour 3. For here, Lincoln, at some point, it's been debated whether it was 1862 or 1864, he sits down, takes a little piece of lined paper, there's no date on it, there's no title. This title was given by John Hay in 1872. I traveled to Brown University to hold that little piece of lined paper in my hands. And this is what Lincoln says: "The will of God prevails. In great contest, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be, wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time." The logical, lawyerly Lincoln at work here. "In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet, the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect His purpose. I am almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end. Yet, think of it. Lincoln is the commander-in-chief. He's supposed to be ending the contest. But his private thoughts, he never thought we would see this. He's struggling with the question, where is God in the Civil War? By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds." How long do you think it took Lincoln to write that? Well, we just read it in about 60 seconds. I think it took him hours. Once he was sitting, we don't have time for this anymore in our electronic age, and his secretary said to him, "Are you sleeping?" He said, "No, I'm thinking. My eyes are closed, but if you'll allow me, I'm just thinking here. I'm brooding. I'm reflecting. I'm contemplating. I travel through airports and I see people just wired, and I think, do we have any time anymore to think, to reflect, to brood? That's where the deepest part of the human spirit resides." So this is a window that I want to open up. Does it define every aspect of Lincoln's religious belief? No. But more importantly, it says, here is a man struggling with the most significant question. We see Lincoln through the prism of his assassination. After his second inaugural address, he will be dead in 41 days. But he saw that address as the platform by which he would seek to be a peace president. He had become a great war president. He thought he would be a much better peace president. He said once in a lecture he was intending to give the lawyers, the lawyer has a supreme opportunity to be a peacemaker. Gamblers in the street were betting that Abraham Lincoln would be reelected and would serve 3 terms all the way to March 1873. There were no term limits. Whether he would have chosen to do so is another question. So Lincoln, I suggest through these words, somehow speaks across time. I'm an historian, and I want faithfully and with integrity to try to place whoever we study within their historical context. Sometimes we ask questions of Lincoln that are unfair questions because we do not allow him to be a man of the middle of the 19th century. And yet I suggest to us that he's one of the very, very few people whose words still speak to us today. In the commemoration of the first anniversary of 9/11, the people of New York City sought a poet or a politician who could give voice to those deep feelings. In the end, they simply recited the Gettysburg Address together. May I close with this? Lincoln was a person who had a great reverence for America's past. He had read the biography of George Washington. He revered Thomas Jefferson and his words, all men are created equal. But in his address to Congress, what we would now today call the State of the Union address at the end of 1862, he offered these words: "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. The founders, as great as they are, passed on the issue of slavery. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And I think Abraham Lincoln is saying to us this evening, with great reverence